In today's episode, we're going to talk about how to make stereo effects or very wide stereo sounds compatible in mono. If you like these videos, please don't forget to like and subscribe below so we can continue to make them for you. So this is a good question because I think mono compatibility is becoming more and more something we need to keep in mind, because when you look at things like Google Home, Amazon Echoes, all those little speakers that are becoming something that people listen to music on, a lot of them do some to mono. They've just got the one speaker. So it's something to consider, like checking your mix in mono, making sure that the main elements survive that transition. What makes something not collapse to mono very well? And that's going to be phase differences between the left and the right channel, because mono is you're just summing the left and the right together. So this question asks about a very wide sound, which I can hear as two different things. One, there's this effect of trying to push things outside of the speakers, and that definitely relies on that sort of phase trickery. The way I do it, and the way I've always heard about it being done, is if you've got a stereo signal like a synth pad or something, you duplicate it, swap the channels, and invert the phase. And that has this effect of pushing it almost outside the speakers. That doesn't collapse to mono very well. Like I said, you're combining a phase inverted signal with itself, and you're gonna get cancellation. One way to get around that, if you still really want that sort of outside the speakers effect, would be to, instead of just duplicating the track, run it through just a short reverb. Doesn't have to be any reverb in particular. A basic room would be fine. Just make sure that the reverb is 100% wet and use that as your duplicate signal. It's kind of gonna give the same effect, but because the reverb becomes this decorrelated signal that's not an exact copy of the dry signal, when you collapse that to mono, it's gonna survive much better than if you just use a duplicate. So that's for that crazy stereo widening effect. If you are talking about just having things be wide, kind of exist at the outer edges of the panning spectrum, you get width from differences in the signal. So I find if you've got a mono signal and you want to make it stereo, it's always going to be better to just retrack it and pan two different takes off of each other. Just because the natural differences in your playing, and for bonus points, try and change something about the sound a little bit. If you're tracking guitar, swap out the guitar, go to a different pickup, use a different amp setting. All these little things will help separate the two elements. I find delays are a better tool than any kind of phase manipulation. So you use what's called a Haas delay. Send the signal to a delay bus that is set 100% wet, no repeats, and then you just use, doesn't have to be much, like 20 milliseconds, 30 milliseconds, even up to 40 milliseconds. That has the effect of, you don't hear it as a discrete echo. The delay time is too short, but it lives as a sort of extension of the sound, and that lets you pan them off each other and get that sense of width. So in terms of making things wide that collapse to mono, that survive the transition to mono well, I would stay away from any sort of phase manipulation. But if you have to use phase manipulation, try and use it on some signal that is not a direct copy of the actual signal that you're trying to make wide. Because then when you sum them together in the mono process, it's just gonna disappear, or mostly disappear, and you're gonna get that weird comb filtery kind of sound, which is probably not what you're going for. Hey everyone. Thanks for joining me over here for this brief excursion into audio demo land. I'm just going to quickly go over a couple of the techniques that I talked about in today's episode, just to show you, one, how to set them up in the DAW, because there is like a little bit of rooting and kind of bus work going on. And then two, just to show you how they sound, so you can make up your own mind whether or not you think they'd be worth the trouble to try in your own mixes. So I've got this session here, just a basic little session, and the first thing we're going to tackle is the Haas delay, which is really just a fancy way of saying a very short delay. So I don't know if you noticed, there's just a very lonely tambourine sitting over on the left. I want to make that tambourine, which is a mono track, I want to make it stereo. I want to have it on the left and on the right. So if I've only got the mono track to work with, here's how I would go about doing that. You could either set up a send, or probably a quicker way, if your DAW allows for it, is to just duplicate the track, especially if you're just working with one track. If you're working with multiple tracks, going to ascend is a bit easier. But here I'm just going to duplicate the track, Tambourine 2, that's a perfectly adequate name, and pan it to the right. But because I'm just sending the same signal to the left and the right channels, it's just going to appear in the center. Yeah, so that's not what I want. What I want is to have it sound like I track two tambourines. So what I'm going to do is insert on this channel just a basic delay. So essentially what I'm doing with this is I'm using the delay to completely replace the signal, to essentially offset it from the other track. So I'm not using it for echo or anything like that. So what we've got to do is put our mix at 100%. No feedback. Things like high and low cut, I mean, you can mess around with them if you want. I'm just leaving it clean. I don't want it synced to tempo. So as far as the time goes, if you look online, if you look up Haas delay, the literature usually says it goes anywhere from 1 millisecond to about 35 milliseconds. Personally, I find the usable kind of functional range for this effect, the way I want to hear it, is about 20 to 40 milliseconds. If you go lower than that, especially if you get into the 1 to 3 millisecond range, one, I find the effect not particularly pronounced, but also you run the risk that when you collapse to mono, you're going to get phase cancellation in the critical frequency bands because you're not offsetting it by that much. Going up to like 20, 30, 40 milliseconds, I find the effect more pronounced and it collapses to mono quite well. Around 40 milliseconds, it starts to sound pretty loose in terms of the stereo panning. Getting much beyond 40 milliseconds, you're going to start to hear it almost like slap across the stereo spectrum. So you'll hear something on the left and then you'll kind of hear it move over to the right, like this sort of call and response echo, which isn't necessarily what you want for this particular effect. We want it to sound like we tracked two separate things individually, not for it to sound like I'm affecting it in some obvious way. So to start with, I'm going to go to 30 milliseconds and let's hear what that sounds like. Yep, sounds like stereo tambourines. It sounds more complicated. Using fancy words like Haas delay just makes it sound more complicated than it is. It's really, you're just offsetting a track by a little bit, and that creates enough of a difference that you're going to hear them as two discrete events. The more things you can do to bake in a difference, so EQing each side slightly differently, compressing each side slightly differently, saturation, anything you can do to create some sort of difference between the signals is just going to exaggerate that stereo effect. All right, so the next thing I wanted to talk about is this kind of exaggerated stereo width effect, where it's almost like you're pushing the sound outside of the speakers a little bit. And here we need to resort to some phase trickery, which generally doesn't collapse to mono very well. So there's one little trick you can try that will help this effect collapse a little bit better. So I've got these two guitar effect signals, kind of left and right. I'm going to try just using this to kind of push them outside the speakers a little bit. So what I need to do is just quickly create a stereo bus with these channels. So here's the bus. We're just going to call it guitar effects. All right. Now what I need to do, because I'm going to mix this other signal back in parallel, so we're not going to affect the bus itself. We're going to need to send that to a second bus. I'll just call that guitar effects. effects. There's different ways of doing this in your DAW, but you just need something that lets you swap the left and right channels and also invert the phase of both channels. So in Studio One, that's this handy little character called the mix tool. So I'm going to swap channels. I'm going to invert the left and the right. I'm also going to have to send to that channel. So here's what it sounds like. It's kind of a subtle effect, and it almost like pushes the center away, and that's how you get that extra width. But it can still kind of be a cool thing. Okay, so let's listen to it with everything in. Okay, I like how that sounds. It sort of has this way of kind of just pushing everything out to the outer edges and kind of giving it a little bit more space to sit in. Thing is, if I collapse to mono on this, you'll just hear the sound completely disappear. So, I mean, maybe this is something you don't really care about. For little effects like this, maybe it doesn't matter that much that, you know, mono gets in the way. But if it is something where you really do want this thing to survive collapsing to mono, a nice way to sort of dance around the phase cancellation that's going to happen is if we just replace this signal with just a basic room reverb. So I like to put it in front of my mix tool. So essentially what we're doing, it's almost like the Haas delay, where we're just completely replacing the sound with a reverb sound. So it's still going to have, you know, I tend to use shorter room style reverb, stuff that's quite neutral, because it's still going to sound like the sound, but it's going to change it enough that when you mix it back in, when you mix this polarity inverted channel swapped version back in with the dry sound, the cancellation just won't happen, or at least not to the extent that it would if you just left the sound alone. So just, you know, a basic little reverb. Make sure it's 100% wet so that it's completely replacing the sound. So there, I kind of get to have my cake and eat it too. I get to get this extra nice little bit of width, but it's able to survive the collapse to mono much better than if I just had the effect without the reverb. Cool. So hopefully this gives you an idea of you know, how to set this stuff up with aux sends, parallel buses, duplicate tracks, you know, all the sort of logistical aspects of setting this stuff up, but also just how it sounds and whether this is something you want to use. Some of these effects are more useful than others. Like the Haas delay I use all the time. It's a great way to take a mono source and make it stereo without resorting to any kind of polarity inversion or phase trickery. It's just a straight delay, very simple, very elegant, collapses to mono well, and even in stereo, it doesn't give me any of those sort of uncomfortable artifacts that polarity inversion stereo solutions, they sound to my ears a little bit. There's just this weird kind of tearing apart, brain swallowing itself kind of feeling, which if I can avoid it, I'd rather do that. But as we've seen, phase inversion does have its uses, and it can kind of give you this really cool additional width that just straight up delay won't. But on its own, if you're just using the dry signal, it can really wreak havoc when you collapse to mono, because you're essentially just mixing in polarity inverted signals with themselves, which will always cancel out. So using something like a reverb is just, in my opinion, a very simple, elegant solution where you're replacing the sound with something that still sounds kind of like itself, enough like itself that you'll get the benefit of the effect, but it will be different enough that when you combine it with the polarity inverted signal, most of the effect still survives. So I hope this was helpful, and see you next time. Hey everyone, thanks for watching this video. If you want to see more of them, please don't forget to like and subscribe, and feel free to leave any questions you have in the comment section below.